I sat across from my parents and sister in that sterile courtroom, watching them paint me as nothing more than a broken, unstable veteran who deserved nothing from my grandfather's estate. Jessica's voice cracked with fake emotion as she screamed at the judge that I was just a homeless veteran, unfit to inherit anything. My father Frank nodded solemnly while my mother Margaret dabbed her eyes with tissue. Judge Harrison seemed completely convinced by their performance. That's when I reached into my jacket, pulled out a single document, and placed it quietly on his desk. The judge's face drained of all color instantly. He looked up at the packed courtroom and said only these words, "Lock the doors. Nobody leaves this room." 6 months earlier, everything in my world had made sense. My grandfather William Henderson had been my anchor through 2 deployments in Afghanistan, sending care packages and letters that kept me grounded when mortar shells shook our forward operating base near Kandahar. As a combat engineer, I'd spent 3 years diffusing improvised explosive devices and rebuilding infrastructure in villages where children played among the rubble we cleared. Grandpa's construction company back in Ohio had given me something to look forward to when my service ended. When the Red Cross message reached me in January informing me that Grandpa had passed away from what doctors called natural causes, I felt like someone had torn a piece of my soul away. William Henderson had built his construction business from nothing after returning from Vietnam, growing it into a company worth $4.7 million with residential properties scattered across 3 counties. He'd been more than family to me. He'd been my hero. I flew home for the funeral wearing my dress blues, expecting to grieve with the people who should have understood my loss. Instead, I found my family acting like vultures, circling fresh carrion. My father Frank seemed more interested in discussing property values than mourning his own father. My mother Margaret kept asking the funeral director about insurance policies and estate procedures. My sister Jessica, who'd barely visited Grandpa in the past 5 years, suddenly appeared devastated by his passing. The will reading took place 3 days after the burial. Attorney Donald Kramer, Grandpa's longtime lawyer, explained that the estate would be divided equally between Jessica and me, with our parents Frank and Margaret serving as executors until all legal matters concluded. The construction company, the main house, 4 rental properties, and liquid assets totaling nearly $200,000 would be split down the middle. Jessica smiled sweetly and thanked the lawyer. My parents nodded approvingly. Everyone seemed pleased with the arrangement. That's when the first warning signs appeared. Within a week, Frank and Margaret had moved into Grandpa's house, claiming they needed to maintain the property during the estate settlement process. When I called to discuss business operations and property management, nobody answered. When I drove to the house, I found new locks on the doors and security cameras pointed at the driveway. My own family had locked me out of my inheritance before Grandpa's body had even grown cold in the ground. I'd been staying at a cheap motel near the VA hospital, using my disability benefits to cover basic expenses while transitioning back to civilian life. Combat engineers develop strong investigative instincts, and something about my family's behavior triggered every alarm bell in my head. Grandpa had always been sharp, organized, and transparent about his business dealings. The idea that he'd want his family fighting over money instead of honoring his memory felt completely wrong. My attempts to contact the family directly led nowhere. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages received no responses. When I showed up at my father's construction office, the receptionist claimed he was unavailable and suggested I schedule an appointment through his lawyer. My own father was hiding behind legal representation rather than talking to his son about his father's estate. The isolation campaign escalated quickly. Neighbors who'd known me since childhood started avoiding eye contact when I walked through town. Old family friends crossed the street rather than acknowledge me. Someone had been spreading stories, and I had a growing suspicion about who was behind the rumors. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a certified letter from Patricia Glenwood, attorney at law. The thick envelope contained legal documents challenging my mental competency to inherit any portion of Grandpa's estate. According to the filing, my parents and sister were concerned about my psychological stability following my military service. They claimed I'd been exhibiting signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, including violent outbursts, substance abuse, and threats against family members. Every single allegation was a complete fabrication. The documents detailed supposed incidents where I'd threatened family members, destroyed property, and displayed behavior indicating I was a danger to myself and others. They cited my military service as evidence of psychological trauma that rendered me unfit to manage financial assets or make responsible decisions. The filing requested an immediate psychological evaluation and the appointment of a legal guardian to protect me from my own alleged instability. I stared at those papers in the motel parking lot, feeling like someone had sucker punched me in the gut. My own family was systematically destroying my reputation and stealing my inheritance while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. They were using my military service, something I'd been proud of, as a weapon against me. That evening, I drove past Grandpa's house and saw something that made my blood run cold. A large moving truck sat in the driveway, and workers were loading furniture and boxes under my father's supervision. Through the windows, I could see empty rooms where Grandpa's belongings had been stored for decades. Frank was systematically stripping the house of everything valuable, claiming it was necessary for estate management. The next morning, I discovered they'd already sold 2 of Grandpa's rental properties without any notification or court approval. $600,000 had disappeared into accounts I couldn't access or monitor. When I called Attorney Kramer to report the unauthorized sales, his secretary informed me that the family had terminated his services and hired new representation. My own family had declared war on me, and I was the last person to realize the battle had already begun. Living out of my pickup truck in various parking lots around town gave me an unexpected advantage in investigating what my family had been doing behind Grandpa's back. Military training taught me patience, observation skills, and how to gather intelligence without being detected. I started following paper trails and asking questions that made my family's conspiracy much clearer. The first breakthrough came from Ruby Martinez, an elderly neighbor who'd lived next door to Grandpa for over 20 years. Ruby had watched Frank and Margaret coming and going from the house at odd hours during the months before Grandpa's death, often carrying boxes and paperwork. She'd overheard heated arguments about money and property, including one conversation where Jessica had shouted about making sure Alton never got his hands on anything that belonged to the family. Ruby had found it strange that Grandpa stopped taking his daily walks or tending his garden during his final months. When she'd asked Margaret about his health, she'd been told that he was suffering from dementia and couldn't safely leave the house unsupervised. Ruby knew this was nonsense because she'd talked with Grandpa just weeks before his death, and his mind had been completely sharp. Armed with Ruby's observations, I started digging into financial records that were available through public sources. Property transfer documents revealed a pattern of suspicious activity dating back 3 years. Frank had been using power of attorney privileges to refinance Grandpa's properties, taking out loans against the equity and pocketing the cash. The refinancing had saddled the estate with over $800,000 in debt that hadn't existed when Grandpa was managing his own affairs. The construction company records painted an even darker picture. Frank had been billing Grandpa's business for phantom renovation projects on properties that had never been touched. Invoices showed charges for materials that were never delivered and labor that was never performed. Equipment purchases were inflated by enormous markups, with the difference being pocketed by Frank through shell companies he'd created using Grandpa's business licenses. Jessica's role in the conspiracy became clear when I spoke with Dr. Amanda Foster, Grandpa's primary care physician. According to Dr. Foster, Jessica had accompanied Grandpa to most of his appointments during his final year, always insisting on speaking with the doctor privately about his condition. She'd claimed that Grandpa was becoming confused and paranoid, particularly about his grandson Alton, whom he supposedly believed was trying to steal from him. Dr. Foster had found these reports puzzling because Grandpa had always spoken positively about me during our private conversations. However, Jessica's persistence and apparent concern had led the doctor to prescribe mild anti-anxiety medications to help Grandpa cope with what she believed was age-related paranoia. Looking back, Dr. Foster realized that Jessica had been manipulating the medical narrative to support a story about Grandpa's declining mental state. The prescription records revealed another layer of fraud. Margaret, who worked as an administrator at Mercy General Hospital, had access to medical systems that allowed her to alter prescription dosages and add medications that hadn't been authorized by physicians. Grandpa's pharmacy records showed he'd been receiving powerful sedatives and antipsychotic drugs that Dr. Foster had never prescribed. My investigation into Frank's business revealed he was facing financial ruin long before Grandpa's death. The family construction company owed over $300,000 to suppliers had outstanding tax liens with both state and federal agencies and was being sued by multiple clients for incomplete work. Frank had been stealing from Grandpa's company to keep his own business afloat, creating a spiral of debt that threatened to destroy both enterprises. The power of attorney documents that gave Frank control over Grandpa's affairs had been signed during a period when medical records showed Grandpa was heavily medicated with drugs that would have impaired his judgment. The signature analysis I arranged through a private investigator revealed inconsistencies, suggesting the documents might have been signed under duress, or while Grandpa was not mentally competent. Bank statements showed a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals and transfers that accelerated during Grandpa's final months. Money was moved from his primary accounts into investment funds, controlled by Frank, then transferred again into accounts belonging to shell companies that Frank and Margaret had created. Over $1.2 million had been systematically stolen from Grandpa's estate while he was allegedly suffering from dementia that prevented him from understanding what was happening. The most heartbreaking discovery came when I found letters that Grandpa had written but never sent. Hidden in his bedroom desk drawer were dozens of handwritten notes expressing his confusion about missing money, his concern about family members who seemed to be stealing from him, and his desperate desire to see his grandson Alton before it was too late. The letters revealed that Grandpa had been fully aware of the theft, but had been isolated from anyone who could help him stop it. One letter dated just 2 weeks before his death contained a sentence that made me want to drive to the cemetery and dig up his grave so I could hug him one more time. Alton is the only person in this family who ever loved me for who I am instead of what I own. If something happens to me, I hope he knows that everything I built was meant to give him a chance at the life he deserves. My family hadn't just stolen money from a vulnerable elderly man. They'd stolen his final months of peace, poisoned his relationship with his doctor, and prevented him from spending time with the grandson he loved. They'd turned his golden years into a nightmare of confusion and isolation while systematically looting everything he'd worked to build. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed something more concrete than financial records and witness statements to prove criminal activity in court. That's when I remembered Grandpa's habit of keeping detailed records of everything important that happened in his life. If he'd suspected his family was stealing from him, there was a chance he'd documented the evidence somewhere they couldn't find it. Finding his hidden safe would require getting back into the house where Frank and Margaret were now living. But after weeks of sleeping in my truck and gathering evidence of their crimes, I was ready to take some calculated risks to get justice for the man who deserved so much better from his own family. Breaking into my grandfather's house felt wrong on every level, even though I technically owned half of everything inside it. Frank and Margaret had changed the locks and installed a security system, but military training had taught me how to bypass basic residential protections without leaving evidence of forced entry. I waited until they left for what appeared to be a dinner date then slipped through a basement window that connected to the crawl space beneath the foundation. Grandpa's workshop in the basement looked exactly as it had during my childhood visits, except everything valuable had been removed. His tool chest sat empty, and the workbench where he'd taught me basic carpentry had been stripped clean. But I wasn't looking for tools. I was searching for the floor safe he'd installed beneath his workbench 30 years earlier, covered by a removable section of concrete flooring that looked like part of the foundation. The safe was still there, hidden beneath layers of dust and workshop debris that Frank had been too lazy to clean up properly. The combination lock hadn't been changed since Grandpa had first shown it to me during a visit home from Afghanistan. He'd given me the numbers in case something happened to him, and I needed access to important documents. The combination was my military service number, followed by his birth year, 37948219228. The safe contained exactly what I'd hoped to find, plus evidence that was far worse than anything I'd imagined. Grandpa's second will dated just 5 days before his death left his entire estate to me alone. The document had been properly witnessed and notarized, making it legally supersede the earlier will that divided assets between Jessica and me. According to the attached letter, Grandpa had discovered the extent of his family's theft and wanted to ensure that none of his assets would reward their betrayal. Jessica would receive nothing except a $1 token inheritance that legally acknowledged her existence while explicitly excluding her from any meaningful benefit. The bank statements in the safe documented every unauthorized transaction that Frank and Margaret had made during the previous 3 years. Grandpa had been secretly monitoring his accounts through online banking, printing monthly statements that tracked exactly how much money was being stolen and where it was going. The detailed records showed that my family had embezzled over $1.4 million through fraudulent loans, inflated construction bills, and direct account transfers. But the audio recordings were what transformed my investigation from a civil matter into a criminal case. Grandpa had been secretly recording conversations with family members using a small digital device hidden in his living room. The recordings captured Frank and Margaret discussing their plans to drain his accounts before he died, Jessica talking about the need to discredit me, so I wouldn't contest the will, and worst of all, conversations about increasing Grandpa's medication to keep him compliant and confused. In one recording dated 3 weeks before his death, I could hear Margaret's voice, explaining to Frank that she'd been adding sedatives to Grandpa's evening medication to ensure he slept through the night while they moved more assets out of his accounts. Frank's response made my hands shake with rage. Good. The old man won't last much longer anyway, and we need to clean out everything before Alton gets home from the war. Another recording captured Jessica's voice discussing their strategy for handling my return from military service. We'll tell everyone he's crazy from his time overseas. People always believe that story about veterans. Nobody will take his word against all 3 of ours, especially if we can get him committed for psychiatric evaluation. The most damning recording was a conversation between Frank and Dr. Paul Stevens, the county coroner, discussing how to handle Grandpa's death certificate. Frank was apparently paying Dr. Stevens to list the cause of death as natural causes related to heart failure rather than conducting a thorough autopsy that might reveal evidence of drug overdose or poisoning. Dr. Stevens agreed to falsify the certificate in exchange for $5,000 and future construction work on his personal residence. Medical records hidden in the safe showed that Grandpa had been documenting his symptoms during his final months: severe drowsiness, confusion, difficulty breathing, and periods where he couldn't remember what had happened during entire days. He'd suspected he was being poisoned, but hadn't known how to prove it or who to trust with his suspicions. His own family had isolated him so effectively that he died alone with his fears, unable to protect himself or seek help. Insurance documents revealed that Frank and Margaret had purchased a life insurance policy on Grandpa worth $1 million, using forged medical information to conceal his true health status from the insurance company. The policy had been purchased just 6 months before his death, with premiums paid using money stolen from his own accounts. They'd essentially used his money to bet on his death while simultaneously poisoning him to ensure they'd collect on their investment. The final piece of evidence was a letter Grandpa had written to me, but never had the chance to send. The handwritten note explained everything he'd discovered about his family's betrayal and expressed his regret about not being stronger in fighting back against their manipulation. The letter ended with words that broke my heart. Alton, you were the only light in my life during these dark months. I'm sorry I couldn't protect what I built for you, but I've hidden evidence that will help you get justice when I'm gone. Don't let them destroy your future like they destroyed my final years. You're stronger than all of them combined, and you deserve better than what this family has given you. I photographed every document, copied every audio file, and sealed the originals back in the safe to prevent Frank and Margaret from discovering that their evidence had been compromised. But before I left the house, I made one additional discovery that changed everything about how I planned to handle their crimes. In Margaret's bedroom dresser, hidden beneath piles of clothing, I found correspondence with Dr. Stevens about the specific drugs that had been used to sedate Grandpa during his final weeks. The letters detailed dosage recommendations that would cause disorientation and memory loss without triggering suspicion from his primary care physician. One letter discussed increasing the dosages to levels that might cause respiratory failure, essentially providing a murder manual disguised as medical advice. My family hadn't just stolen from a vulnerable old man. They'd systematically poisoned him over months, isolated him from help, and ultimately killed him to prevent discovery of their crimes. This wasn't elder abuse or financial fraud. This was premeditated murder committed by people who'd shared Christmas dinners and family vacations with their victim. Walking back to my truck with evidence of my grandfather's murder felt like carrying the weight of his ghost on my shoulders. But for the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, I had a clear mission with defined objectives and measurable outcomes. I was going to make sure that every person who'd participated in destroying my grandfather's life would face consequences that matched the scope of their betrayal. Justice was coming, and it would be thorough, public, and absolutely devastating. Word of my investigation must have leaked somehow, because Frank and Margaret's legal strategy shifted into overdrive within days of my discovering the safe. The restraining orders they'd filed claiming I was dangerous suddenly expanded into emergency protection orders that barred me from coming within 500 feet of any property they occupied. According to the new legal documents, I'd allegedly broken into their home, made death threats, and displayed behavior indicating I was planning to harm family members. Every allegation was fabricated, but the orders were signed by Judge William Harrison, who'd apparently accepted my family's word without requiring any evidence to support their claims. The emergency protection effectively prevented me from accessing any portion of Grandpa's estate while they continued liquidating assets and destroying evidence. The character assassination campaign that followed was more sophisticated than anything I'd experienced during combat operations overseas. Margaret's position at Mercy General Hospital gave her access to medical professionals who were willing to provide expert opinions about my alleged psychological instability. She'd convinced 3 different doctors to sign statements claiming that my behavior during hospital visits showed signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, paranoid delusions, and potential for violence against family members. None of these doctors had ever examined me or reviewed my actual military medical records, but their professional credentials gave weight to Margaret's lies about my mental state. The statements became part of a growing file that painted me as a dangerous veteran who'd been psychologically broken by military service and was now targeting his own family for imagined grievances. Frank took a different approach to destroying my credibility. He hired Dale Murphy, a private investigator who'd been fired from the police department for excessive force complaints and evidence tampering. Murphy's job was to follow me, document my activities, and create situations where I might appear to be stalking or harassing family members. The goal was to build a case for involuntary psychiatric commitment that would remove me from the inheritance equation permanently. Murphy's surveillance techniques were obvious to anyone with military training, but his presence served a dual purpose. Following me around town reinforced the narrative that I was dangerous enough to require professional monitoring, while also intimidating potential witnesses who might have been willing to support my case. People who'd known me since childhood started avoiding me entirely rather than risk getting caught up in what they saw as a dangerous family conflict. The harassment escalated when Jessica launched a social media campaign designed to isolate me from community support. She created Facebook posts describing her fear of her unstable veteran brother who'd threatened her life over their grandfather's money. The posts received hundreds of sympathetic comments from people who didn't know the real story, creating a public narrative that portrayed me as the aggressor in a family dispute that was actually about my defending myself against criminals. Jessica's online campaign included photos of me taken without my knowledge, including pictures of my truck parked in various locations around town. She claimed these photos showed evidence of stalking behavior when they actually documented my legitimate efforts to find affordable places to sleep while investigating my family's crimes. The photos made me look homeless and unstable, reinforcing the story about my inability to function in civilian society. Frank's construction business connections gave him access to local contractors and suppliers who were suddenly unwilling to consider hiring me for any kind of work. When I applied for jobs with companies that had never heard of my family, I discovered that someone had been calling potential employers to warn them about my alleged instability. Phone records I later obtained showed that Jessica had contacted dozens of local businesses claiming she was worried about public safety if they hired her dangerous brother. The financial pressure was deliberate and devastating. Without employment opportunities, I couldn't afford legal representation that might have been effective against my family's expensive attorney. I couldn't maintain a permanent address which supported their claims that I was homeless and unstable. I couldn't even afford proper meals which affected my appearance and made me look exactly like the broken veteran they were claiming I'd become. Margaret's medical connections became more dangerous when she started falsifying psychiatric evaluation reports using her hospital access. She created fake consultation reports claiming that I'd been treated for violent ideation substance abuse and threats against family members. These false records were submitted to the court as evidence supporting their request for a competency hearing that would determine whether I was mentally fit to inherit anything from Grandpa's estate. The fake medical records were sophisticated enough to fool attorneys and judges who weren't familiar with military medical documentation. They included references to combat incidents that had never happened, medication prescriptions that had never been issued, and treatment recommendations that suggested I was a danger to myself and others. Margaret's position at the hospital gave her the access and knowledge necessary to create convincing forgeries that supported her family's lies. Frank's desperation led him to attempt more direct intimidation tactics. He started showing up at places where I was known to spend time, always accompanied by Dale Murphy and sometimes additional men who looked like hired muscle. They'd park nearby and watch me taking photos and making notes, creating an atmosphere of menace that was designed to pressure me into leaving town or dropping my claims against the estate. The intimidation campaign backfired when I recognized one of Frank's associates as Lieutenant Tom Davis, a corrupt police officer who'd been under internal investigation for taking bribes from local businesses. Davis was apparently being paid to provide law enforcement credibility to Frank's harassment campaign, giving the appearance that police were monitoring me as a legitimate threat rather than protecting criminals who were intimidating their victim. The setup attempt happened during my 4th week of living in the truck. Murphy and Davis arranged for me to be pulled over during a routine traffic stop, planning to plant drugs in my vehicle that would justify arrest and imprisonment. They'd underestimated my military training in recognizing hostile surveillance and battlefield awareness of potential threats. I'd been watching Murphy's patterns for days, documenting his movements, and and identifying the best times to avoid confrontation. When I spotted his vehicle positioning for what looked like a coordinated traffic stop, I activated the digital recorder I'd started carrying and made sure my truck's dashboard camera was functioning properly. The arrest attempt was captured on multiple audio and video devices that clearly showed Davis planting evidence while Murphy provided backup. The recording of their conversation during the setup was devastating to their credibility. "This should be enough to get him committed for a psych eval," Davis said, while placing a bag of methamphetamine under my driver's seat. "Nobody's going to believe a crazy veteran over two law enforcement professionals." Murphy's response was equally incriminating. "Frank's paying good money for this, so make sure it sticks." The family wants him locked up until they can get the estate settled and the money moved offshore. Their plan fell apart when I confronted them with evidence of what they were doing, producing copies of the audio and video recordings that proved their conspiracy. Davis retreated immediately, claiming the drugs had been planted by someone else, while Murphy attempted to destroy evidence by grabbing my recording device. The struggle was witnessed by multiple civilians who'd stopped to observe what they thought was a legitimate police action. The failed setup gave me valuable intelligence about my family's connections to corrupt law enforcement and their willingness to commit serious crimes to maintain control of Grandpa's estate. But it also escalated the conflict to a level that could no longer be resolved through civil litigation alone. They'd moved from financial fraud and elder abuse into criminal conspiracy, evidence tampering, and attempted imprisonment of an innocent person. The evidence I'd gathered now documented a criminal enterprise involving multiple felonies committed by family members, corrupt police officers, and medical professionals who'd betrayed their oaths to protect vulnerable people. The time for investigating and gathering evidence was ending. The time for bringing down their entire conspiracy had arrived. The competency hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in Judge Harrison's courtroom, and my family arrived dressed like they were attending a funeral rather than a legal proceeding. Frank wore his best suit and carried a briefcase full of documents that supposedly proved I was mentally unfit to inherit anything from Grandpa's estate. Margaret sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with tissue, preparing to play the role of a concerned mother who feared for her son's safety. Jessica had dressed conservatively and practiced looking frightened whenever she glanced in my direction. Patricia Glenwood, their expensive attorney, had prepared a presentation designed to convince Judge Harrison that I was suffering from severe combat-related psychological trauma that rendered me incapable of making rational financial decisions. She'd arranged for Dr. Marcus Webb, a psychiatrist who'd never examined me, to provide expert testimony about the correlation between military service and violent mental illness. The strategy was to use my time in Afghanistan against me, turning my service to the country into evidence of my unfitness to inherit my grandfather's legacy. I sat at the defendant's table with Robert Chen, a public defender who'd been assigned to my case just 2 days earlier. Chen was competent and dedicated, but he'd had minimal time to review the evidence and no resources to conduct an independent investigation into my family's claims. He'd warned me that the hearing would likely result in a court-ordered psychological evaluation that could take months to complete while my family continued liquidating Grandpa's estate. Judge Harrison opened the proceedings by acknowledging the serious nature of the claims against my mental competency. He explained that the court had a responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from making decisions that might harm themselves or others, especially when substantial financial assets were involved. The tone of his introduction suggested he'd already been persuaded by my family's narrative about my alleged instability. Patricia Glenwood's opening statement was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as legal argument. She painted a picture of a devoted family trying to protect their loved one from his own psychological demons, while preserving an inheritance that would provide for his care and treatment. According to her version of events, I'd returned from military service, displaying classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including paranoid delusions about family members stealing from me and violent threats against people who tried to help me. Dr. Webb's testimony was equally devastating and completely fraudulent. He described my alleged symptoms with clinical precision, explaining how combat exposure often led to paranoid thoughts, aggressive behavior, and difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagined threats. He'd never spoken with me or reviewed my actual medical records, but his professional credentials gave weight to his speculation about my psychological condition. Margaret's testimony was the most painful part of the morning. She spoke tearfully about her fear for my safety and her concern that I might harm myself or others if given access to substantial financial resources. She described incidents that had never happened, conversations that had never taken place, and behavior that existed only in her imagination. Her performance was so convincing that several people in the courtroom gallery were visibly moved by her apparent grief. Jessica's testimony was designed to deliver the emotional climax that would convince Judge Harrison of my unfitness. She described her terror of her own brother claiming that I'd threatened to kill her if she didn't give up her claim to Grandpa's inheritance. She sobbed as she recounted fake incidents where I'd followed her broken into her apartment and sent threatening messages that police could never seem to locate. "He's just a homeless veteran who can't take care of himself," Jessica cried, looking directly at the judge. "How can someone who lives in a truck and can't hold a job be trusted with millions of dollars? He needs help, not money that he'll just waste on alcohol and drugs." The courtroom was completely silent as Jessica finished her testimony. Judge Harrison nodded sympathetically and made notes that suggested he was planning to order the psychological evaluation that would effectively remove me from the inheritance process. Frank and Margaret exchanged satisfied glances, believing they'd successfully destroyed my credibility and secured control of Grandpa's assets. That's when I stood up, walked to the judge's bench, and placed a single document on his desk. The document was Dr. Stephen Park's sworn affidavit detailing the medical evidence he'd discovered while reviewing Grandpa's final blood work at my request. Dr. Park had been Grandpa's cardiologist for over 15 years, and he'd been troubled by inconsistencies between Grandpa's reported symptoms and his actual physical condition during his final months. The affidavit included laboratory results that showed lethal levels of sedatives and antipsychotic drugs that no legitimate physician had prescribed. Judge Harrison's face went white as he read the medical evidence, proving that my grandfather had been systematically poisoned during the months leading up to his death. The document included a forensic analysis of blood samples that Dr. Park had preserved, showing drug concentrations that would have caused the confusion, drowsiness, and respiratory distress that my family had attributed to natural aging. Attached to the affidavit was a flash drive containing the audio recordings from Grandpa's hidden device, including conversations where Margaret discussed adding sedatives to his medication, and Frank talked about accelerating his death timeline to prevent me from returning home before the estate was settled. The recordings proved that my family had been planning Grandpa's murder while I was serving overseas, treating his death as a business decision rather than the loss of a human being they claimed to love. The digital evidence also included forensic analysis of the property transfer documents that Frank had used to steal assets from the estate. Computer analysis proved that Grandpa's signatures had been traced from legitimate documents and applied to fraudulent paperwork, creating an elaborate forgery scheme that had transferred ownership of valuable properties to shell companies controlled by my parents. Dr. Park's affidavit revealed that the coroner, Dr. Paul Stevens, had accepted a bribe to falsify Grandpa's death certificate and avoid conducting an autopsy that would have revealed evidence of poisoning. Stevens had listed the cause of death as natural heart failure while knowing that the actual cause was drug overdose, administered by family members who wanted to inherit his money. The insurance fraud documentation showed that Frank and Margaret had purchased a life insurance policy on Grandpa using forged medical information then poisoned him to collect the payout while simultaneously stealing his assets through fraudulent property transfers. They'd used his own money to finance their plot to kill him, creating a criminal conspiracy that spanned multiple felonies and involved corruption of medical and law enforcement professionals. Judge Harrison read the document in complete silence while my family sat frozen in their chairs. Frank had turned away from the judge's bench, apparently unable to maintain eye contact with the evidence of his crimes. Margaret was trembling visibly, and Jessica had stopped crying as the reality of their situation became clear. "Lock the doors," Judge Harrison said quietly to the bailiff. "Nobody leaves this room." The judge reached for his phone and spoke briefly with someone who I later learned was Detective Lisa Campbell from the County District Attorney's Office. Within minutes, the courtroom was surrounded by law enforcement officers who'd been waiting for this moment since I'd first contacted them with evidence of my family's crimes. The document I'd placed on Judge Harrison's desk wasn't just evidence of elder abuse or financial fraud. It was proof of premeditated murder committed by people who'd spent months planning their victim's death while he trusted them to care for him during his most vulnerable time. Everything they'd done to destroy my credibility and steal my inheritance had been part of a larger conspiracy to conceal the fact that they'd killed my grandfather for his money. The investigation that had started with my suspicions about missing money had uncovered a criminal enterprise that involved murder fraud, bribery, and corruption of multiple public officials. The courtroom where my family had expected to complete their theft had become the place where their conspiracy finally collapsed under the weight of evidence they'd never imagined I could gather. Justice for my grandfather was about to begin. And it would be more thorough and devastating than anything my family had imagined possible when they'd first decided that killing him was an acceptable price for inheriting his wealth. Detective Lisa Campbell and her team moved through the courtroom with the efficiency of professionals who'd been preparing for this moment since receiving my evidence 3 weeks earlier. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had been conducting parallel investigations into the banking and insurance fraud, while state police had been building cases against the corrupt officials who'd helped my family cover up their crimes. The coordinated law enforcement response turned Judge Harrison's courtroom into the command center for dismantling a criminal enterprise that had tentacles reaching throughout local government and medical establishments. Frank was the first to be placed in handcuffs, charged with first-degree murder, elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Detective Campbell read his rights while he stared at the floor, apparently unable to comprehend how his carefully planned scheme had been exposed so thoroughly. The man who'd spent months portraying himself as a concerned son protecting his father's legacy was revealed as a calculating killer who'd murdered his own parent for money. Margaret's arrest was more dramatic because she collapsed when Detective Campbell explained that her hospital records had been subpoenaed and analyzed by federal investigators. The fake psychiatric evaluations she'd created to discredit me were evidence of her conspiracy to cover up murder, while her access to medical systems had provided the knowledge necessary to poison Grandpa without triggering suspicion from his primary care physicians. Federal agents had already frozen her bank accounts and seized her hospital access credentials as part of the ongoing investigation. Jessica's breakdown began the moment she realized that law enforcement had been recording her phone calls for the past 2 weeks. Her social media campaign against me had been monitored by FBI cybercrime specialists who documented her efforts to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses. When Detective Campbell informed her that her apartment had been searched that morning and evidence of her participation in the conspiracy had been seized, Jessica started confessing to everything in a desperate attempt to negotiate a plea bargain. "I never wanted to hurt Grandpa." Jessica sobbed as the handcuffs were applied. "Frank said we were just protecting the family assets from being wasted. I didn't know they were going to kill him. I thought we were just making sure he didn't give everything to Alton." Her confession revealed details that even my investigation hadn't uncovered. Jessica had been tasked with isolating Grandpa from his friends and neighbors, convincing him that people were trying to take advantage of his generosity. She'd monitored his phone calls and intercepted his mail to prevent him from seeking help when he started suspecting that family members were stealing from him. Her role as his caretaker had been a cover for ensuring that he remained isolated and vulnerable, while Frank and Margaret escalated their abuse. Patricia Glenwood's arrest came as a surprise to almost everyone in the courtroom except the FBI agents who'd been investigating her law firm's financial records. The expensive attorney who'd been representing my family's interests had known about the fraudulent property transfers and forged documents accepting payment from money that had been stolen from Grandpa's accounts. Her participation in the conspiracy included filing false legal documents and suborning perjury from witnesses who'd provided fake testimony about my mental state. The arrests extended beyond my immediate family as Detective Campbell's team rounded up the network of corrupt officials who'd helped cover up the crimes. Dr. Paul Stevens, the coroner, who'd falsified Grandpa's death certificate, was charged with accepting bribes and obstruction of justice. Lieutenant Tom Davis, the police officer who'd attempted to plant drugs in my truck, faced charges for evidence tampering and conspiracy to commit perjury. Dale Murphy, the private investigator who'd been hired to harass and intimidate me, was arrested for stalking and witness intimidation. Federal agents simultaneously raided multiple locations connected to the conspiracy, seizing financial records, computer equipment, and physical evidence that documented the scope of my family's crimes. Frank's construction office yielded boxes of fraudulent billing records and forged contracts that showed how he'd been stealing from Grandpa's business for years. Margaret's hospital office contained files proving she'd been falsifying medical records and accessing confidential information to support the family's legal strategy. The asset seizure was immediate and comprehensive. Federal marshals froze every bank account connected to my family, preventing them from accessing any money that might represent proceeds from their crimes. Properties that had been purchased with stolen funds were placed under government control pending resolution of the criminal cases. Even the house where Frank and Margaret had been living was sealed as a crime scene while investigators searched for additional evidence of the conspiracy. Judge Harrison's courtroom became a processing center for what investigators described as one of the most elaborate elder abuse and murder conspiracies they'd encountered. The case involved multiple felonies committed by family members, corruption of public officials, and systematic fraud that had continued for years, while my grandfather suffered and eventually died at the hands of people who claimed to love him. Dr. Stephen Park's presence in the courtroom provided additional medical testimony that sealed the murder charges against Frank and Margaret. His analysis of Grandpa's preserved blood samples proved that the drug levels found in his system could only have been administered deliberately over an extended period. The medications found in his body were powerful sedatives and antipsychotic drugs that would have caused the confusion and disorientation that my family had attributed to dementia. The most damning evidence came from Margaret's own medical notes, discovered during the hospital raid, which documented her research into drug interactions and dosage levels that could cause respiratory failure in elderly patients. She'd essentially created a murder manual while working as a medical professional, using her knowledge to kill a family member while avoiding detection by other healthcare providers. Jessica's confession continued as investigators revealed the extent of the insurance fraud that had been central to the family's financial planning. The life insurance policy purchased on Grandpa's life had been obtained using medical information that Margaret had falsified through her hospital connections. The family had essentially bet on Grandpa's death while actively working to cause it, treating his murder as an investment strategy rather than the elimination of a human being. The scope of the investigation expanded when federal agents discovered that Frank's construction business had been used to launder money stolen from other elderly clients beyond my grandfather. The conspiracy had apparently been operating for years, targeting vulnerable seniors whose assets could be stolen through fake construction projects, inflated billing, and fraudulent property transfers. Grandpa's murder had been the culmination of a criminal enterprise that had victimized multiple families throughout the region. Detective Campbell explained that my decision to contact law enforcement with evidence of the conspiracy had triggered a multi-agency investigation that uncovered corruption and fraud far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. The case was being treated as a priority for multiple reasons: the systematic nature of the crimes, the corruption of public officials, and the use of medical knowledge to commit murder while concealing evidence of the conspiracy. The courtroom that had been intended for my family's final victory over my inheritance claim had become the scene of their complete legal destruction. Every lie they'd told, every document they'd forged, and every crime they'd committed to steal Grandpa's legacy had been exposed and documented by investigators who would ensure that justice was both thorough and public. The investigation was just beginning, but the arrest marked the end of my family's ability to control the narrative about my grandfather's death and their theft of his life's work. The people who'd killed him for money would now face the consequences of their choices, while the grandfather who deserved so much better would finally receive the justice he'd been denied during his final months of life. The trials that followed transformed my family's calculated murder scheme into a public reckoning that exposed the depths of their betrayal and the systematic nature of their crimes. Frank's first-degree murder conviction came after a 3-week trial where prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, including Margaret's medical research into lethal drug dosages and the audio recordings of their conversations about accelerating Grandpa's death. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before finding him guilty on all counts, leading to a sentence of 15 years to life in federal prison. Margaret's trial revealed the sophisticated medical knowledge that had made Grandpa's murder possible while concealing evidence from his primary care physicians. Her conviction on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, healthcare fraud, and elder abuse resulted in a 12-year federal sentence that included permanent revocation of her medical credentials. The judge noted during sentencing that her abuse of medical knowledge to harm a vulnerable patient represented one of the most serious violations of professional trust he'd encountered in 20 years on the bench. Jessica's cooperation with prosecutors earned her a reduced sentence of 8 years for accessory to murder and conspiracy charges, but her testimony provided crucial details about the planning and execution of their grandfather's murder. Her breakdown during Frank's trial, where she described Grandpa's final weeks of confusion and fear, was so devastating that several jurors were visibly emotional. The judge recommended that she receive psychological treatment during her incarceration, noting that her participation in the conspiracy appeared to have been motivated by desperation rather than malice. The civil recovery process was equally satisfying and more personally meaningful than the criminal convictions. Asset forfeiture proceedings recovered not only the original value of Grandpa's estate, but also damages, interest, and penalties that brought the total settlement to over $6 million. The construction company was liquidated, and its assets distributed to clients who'd been defrauded by Frank's schemes, while properties purchased with stolen money were returned to the estate for legitimate distribution. Dr. Paul Stevens lost his medical license and received a 5-year sentence for falsifying death certificates and accepting bribes from families who wanted to conceal evidence of elder abuse. Lieutenant Tom Davis was terminated from the police department and sentenced to 3 years for evidence tampering and conspiracy charges. Dale Murphy's private investigation license was permanently revoked, and he received 18 months for stalking and witness intimidation. Patricia Glenwood's conviction for conspiracy and ethical violations resulted in disbarment and a 2-year sentence, while her law firm faced federal sanctions and civil liability for accepting payment from money that had been stolen from elderly clients. The legal profession's response to her participation in the conspiracy sent a clear message that attorneys who facilitate elder abuse would face severe consequences for violating their professional responsibilities. The personal transformation that emerged from this nightmare was more significant than any financial recovery or legal victory. Working with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a therapist who specialized in helping veterans process complex trauma, I learned to distinguish between the psychological wounds caused by combat service and the emotional devastation inflicted by family betrayal. The therapeutic process revealed that my military experience had actually provided me with the analytical skills and emotional resilience necessary to expose my family's conspiracy and survive their attempts to destroy my credibility. Dr. Mitchell helped me understand that the isolation and self-doubt I'd experienced during the investigation were normal responses to systematic gaslighting by people who should have provided unconditional support. Learning to trust my own perceptions and judgment was essential for rebuilding relationships and moving forward with life plans that honored Grandpa's memory while serving purposes larger than my personal recovery. The construction company that I rebuilt using Grandpa's assets became Henderson Engineering Solutions, specializing in residential projects for elderly clients and veterans transitioning to civilian life. The business model prioritized transparency, honest pricing, and quality workmanship that reflected the values Grandpa had instilled in me during childhood visits to his job sites. Within 2 years, the company was employing 12 people and had earned recognition from the local Chamber of Commerce for ethical business practices. The William Henderson Memorial Fund, established with a portion of the recovered assets, provided housing assistance for homeless veterans and elderly people who were vulnerable to financial exploitation. The fund's programs included legal advocacy, financial literacy, education, and emergency assistance for seniors who were being abused by family members or caregivers. The Memorial Fund served over 200 people during its first 3 years of operation, preventing abuse and providing resources that allowed vulnerable individuals to maintain their independence and dignity. Meeting Sarah Chen changed my understanding of what healthy relationships could provide and how trust could be rebuilt after experiencing profound betrayal. Sarah worked as a social worker specializing in veteran services, and her professional knowledge of military transition issues helped her understand the unique challenges that combat veterans face when returning to civilian life. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized my family relationships. Sarah's support during the business startup phase was invaluable because she understood the importance of creating something meaningful from the ashes of family destruction. Her encouragement and practical advice helped me transform grief and anger into productive energy that honored Grandpa's memory while building a future that reflected lessons learned from surviving his murder and exposing the conspiracy that had killed him. The legal reforms that emerged from our case included stronger protections for elderly people in estate proceedings, mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals who suspect elder abuse, and enhanced background checks for individuals seeking power of attorney over vulnerable adults. Judge Harrison, who'd initially been deceived by my family's lies, became an advocate for judicial education about elder abuse patterns and the sophisticated manipulation techniques used by family members who target elderly relatives. Prison visits with Margaret and Jessica provided opportunities for conversations about accountability, forgiveness, and the possibility of rebuilding relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. Margaret's acknowledgement of her crimes and expression of genuine remorse created a foundation for limited contact that respected boundaries while allowing for some form of family connection. Jessica's participation in prison education programs and her commitment to making amends suggested that rehabilitation was possible, though rebuilding trust would require years of consistent behavioral change. Frank's refusal to accept responsibility for his crimes or acknowledge the harm he'd caused meant that our relationship remained permanently severed. His continued manipulation and blame shifting during prison visits proved that he lacked the capacity for genuine remorse or behavioral change that would be necessary for any form of reconciliation. Some relationships cannot be repaired when the damage is too extensive, and the offender lacks basic human empathy. The life lesson that emerged from this experience centered on the recognition that blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty, love, or honesty, while chosen relationships based on shared values can provide the support and connection that biological families sometimes fail to offer. Understanding this distinction allowed me to build a life surrounded by people who'd earned trust through consistent actions rather than demanding it based on genetic connections that meant nothing when tested by greed and desperation. Standing in the cemetery beside Grandpa's grave, 2 years after the trials concluded, I could finally speak to him with pride about the justice we'd achieved and the legacy we'd preserved. The construction company that bore his name was thriving. The memorial fund was helping people he would have cared about, and the family members who'd killed him were serving appropriate sentences for their crimes. Most importantly, the love and values he'd shared with me had survived their attempts to destroy them, creating a foundation for rebuilding life in ways that honored his memory while serving purposes larger than personal recovery. The journey from that courtroom confrontation to this moment of peace had taught me that justice is possible even when the people who should protect you become your greatest enemies, that healing can emerge from the deepest betrayal, and that the strongest revenge against those who try to destroy you is building a life so meaningful and successful that their attempts to harm you become irrelevant to your happiness and purpose. Sometimes the people who claim to love you will reveal that their affection is conditional on your compliance with their desires, while strangers who share your values will offer support that exceeds anything your biological family provided. Learning to distinguish between authentic love and manipulative control can save your life, protect your resources, and create space for relationships that nurture growth rather than enabling exploitation. If you've experienced family betrayal or elder abuse in your own life, what lessons have you learned about distinguishing between people who truly care about your welfare and those who see you as a resource to be exploited? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like this video. If my story resonated with your experiences, subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to hear more stories about overcoming family trauma, and share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding that justice is possible even in the most difficult family situations. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I hope my grandfather's story inspires you to fight for truth and justice in your own life, no matter how powerful the people opposing you might seem.